All right, so moving into section 7.3. So in this whole chapter, we've been focusing on the cell and the cell's organelles, the functions, that type of thing. Now we're kind of moving into the cell boundaries, and the two boundaries are the cell membrane and the cell wall. So this whole section is going to kind of talk about their structure and their function. First thing, cells are often surrounded by a few things in order to keep them separate from other cells as well as their surroundings. And remember back to the two characteristics of cells. The first one is they contain some type of genetic information, and the second one is they are bound by a cell membrane. So our cell membrane. This is a membrane that's in all cells. It's a thin, flexible barrier. It's a lipid bilayer in which proteins are embedded, and the focus of this is regulation. So you think of the cell membrane, think of regulation. The cell wall is in some cells, and it's rigid and strong, and its focus is on supporting. It's a supporting layer around the cell membrane. It offers the structural support for the cell. So let's focus a little bit more on the specifics. Cell membrane. The cell membrane regulates what enters and leaves the cell and also provides protection and support for the cell. The membrane is a double-layered sheet called a lipid bilayer, and this allows cells to be flexible. The next slide, I'm actually going to show you kind of this lipid bilayer, but the purpose of that kind of helps them be flexible. It also contains proteins and carbohydrates on the surface of the cell, and some of these are going to play a role in how the cell membrane actually will regulate what is coming in and out of the cell. All right, so here is just kind of a little idea. I'm going to shrink this down a little bit of what's going on with the cell. In this first picture up here, again, a lot of you talked about being able to distinguish between a cell wall and a cell membrane, and sometimes it's kind of hard depending on what power you're using. But this is kind of a glimpse of a microscope of what that actual cell membrane is going to look like. We know that there is a lipid bilayer. Think two, bi means two. So we have this lipid bilayer. So one lipid on the top here and another phospholipid on the bottom, and it creates this kind of membrane that is flexible. This is what we were talking about before about some of these proteins and carbohydrates that are on the surface, and these can be carrier proteins, which we're going to talk a little bit more about what their role is when we move more into diffusion and osmosis. But this gives you kind of a quick little snapshot of what is a cell membrane and what does it look like. All right, the cell wall. The cell wall is a layer on the outside of the cell that provides support and protection. Remember, this was the case, support and protection. These are generally present in plants, algae, fungi, and many prokaryotes. So when we talked about the difference between prokaryote and eukaryote, remember focusing on the nucleus, because some of them are going to have that cell wall. Cell walls can also allow certain materials such as water, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and other things to pass through it easily. Its focus is not on regulating what comes in and out, but it does allow for certain things to go in pretty freely. Cell walls are normally produced from carbohydrates and proteins. However, in plant cells, they're made from cellulose. Here's a kind of quick snapshot of what that cell wall is going to look like. Again, very hard with the microscopes that we have to actually kind of distinguish the separation between the cell wall and the cell membrane. But sometimes if you're able to get a really good zoom in on it, you might be able to see that slight little distinction and recognizing that the cell wall is pretty, it's a lot more rigid than the cell membrane is going to be, and it has to do with how it's created. And notice you kind of get these different, almost like weaving of the cellulose that is going to provide it that strength.